what your energy field actually does when you reclaim your original frequency. There is a signal running underneath everything you have ever experienced. Not a metaphor for a signal, an actual electromagnetic broadcast, measurable in the space around your body, generated by your heart and nervous system, radiating outward several feet in every direction at every moment of your life. That signal has been running since before you had language. It was running when you were very young, and the world was still teaching you what you were. It was running when the first person told you that you were too much, or not enough, or that your particular way of being in the world needed to be adjusted to fit something smaller. It was running when you learned, slowly and without realizing you were learning anything at all, that certain parts of yourself were safer kept quiet. And here is what you were never told about that signal during all of those years of adjustment. It never stopped broadcasting your original frequency. Not once. Even when you learned to dim it, even when you layered over it with everything you were taught to be, the original signal kept running underneath, like a radio station that never went off air, even when someone built a wall in front of the receiver. What changes when you reclaim your original frequency is not what most people expect. They expect to feel different. And you do. But the more precise thing that happens is that your energy field stops working against itself. Because right now, if you are like most people who have spent years broadcasting a frequency they did not consciously choose, your field is doing something specific and costly. It is simultaneously broadcasting your original signal and broadcasting the overlay that was placed on top of it. And those two signals are not harmonizing. They are creating interference. And that interference is what your life has been assembling itself around. Today, we are going to go into what that interference actually is, what it does at the level of your electromagnetic field, why the overlay feels more real than the original, even though it is not, and precisely what happens in your field, measurably, physically, in the space around your body, when you begin to reclaim the frequency that was always yours. This is not about becoming someone new. You cannot become someone new. You can only stop broadcasting someone else's signal and return to the one that was already there. Let us begin with what the signal actually is. Not as a concept, as a physical reality. Your heart generates the most powerful electromagnetic field in your body. The HeartMath Institute, which has spent over 3 decades measuring the electromagnetic output of the human heart, has documented that this field extends in a torus shape, meaning it radiates outward from the heart in all directions simultaneously, loops around the body, and re-enters at the feet and the top of the head in a continuous flowing pattern. The field is measurable at a distance of several feet from the body using sensitive magnetometers. It is not a subtle or hypothetical field. It is the same kind of electromagnetic field that physics has been measuring and working with for over a century. It is simply generated by a biological source rather than a mechanical one. What makes this field extraordinary is not just its presence. It is what it carries. The HeartMath researchers discovered that the electromagnetic field generated by your heart encodes information. Specifically, it encodes the pattern of your heart rate variability, which is the rhythmic fluctuation between heartbeats, and that pattern carries information about your emotional and physiological state that is readable by other biological systems. When two people are in close proximity, their heart fields overlap, and when one person's field is in a state of high coherence, meaning the heart rate variability pattern is smooth, ordered, and rhythmically consistent. That coherent field has been shown to influence the heart rate variability of people nearby. Their fields begin to entrain to the coherent one, not because of anything spoke or consciously communicated, because the electromagnetic field itself is carrying information that other fields respond to. This is your aura, not a mystical concept. The measurable electromagnetic field generated by your heart, broadcasting information about your internal state into the space around you at every moment, influencing every field it comes into contact with, and being influenced in return. Now here is where your original frequency comes in. Because what your heart field broadcasts is not random. It is not simply a readout of your mood in any given moment. Beneath the surface, fluctuations of daily emotional experience, your heart field has a baseline pattern, a characteristic signature that is yours specifically. Researchers studying heart rate variability have found that individuals have identifiable baseline patterns that persist across different emotional states and different life circumstances. Your field has a fingerprint, and that fingerprint is what we are calling your original frequency. But here is what happens to that fingerprint when the overlay is installed. When you learn, early and repeatedly, that certain frequencies are not safe to broadcast, your nervous system begins to do something extraordinarily intelligent and extraordinarily costly. It learns to modulate your heart field output. It introduces what researchers call low-frequency coherence disruption. meaning the smooth, ordered rhythm of your heart rate variability begins to carry a secondary pattern layered on top of it. A pattern of guardedness, of monitoring, of the subtle but constant assessment of whether it is safe to be fully present in your own field. And that secondary pattern is not occasional. Once it is installed, it runs continuously. It becomes part of your baseline electromagnetic signature. So your field is now broadcasting two things simultaneously. Your original frequency, which is still there, still running, still generating its characteristic pattern, and the overlay, the learned modulation that says, be smaller, be careful, be something other than what you naturally are. And the quantum field, which does not evaluate your intentions, or read your thoughts, or respond to what you wish were true, responds to the composite signal, the blend, the interference pattern created by your original frequency and the overlay running on top of it. And that interference pattern is what has been shaping what reaches you, what repels from you, and what reality has been assembling around you. When people describe the feeling of not quite living their own life, of feeling like they are performing a version of themselves rather than being themselves, of sensing something underneath their daily experience that is more alive and more true than what they are currently expressing, they are describing this interference. They are feeling the gap between their original frequency and the overlay. The gap is real. It has a measurable correlate in the coherence pattern of the heart field. And the path back is not through the mind alone. It is through the field itself. If this transmission is landing somewhere real in you, take a moment to like this video and subscribe so we can continue going deeper together. And now, let us go further. Let me show you a story, not to illustrate a concept, to show you something about your own field that you may recognize. Her name was Sarah, and from the time she was very young, she had a quality that people noticed without being able to name. Rooms changed when she walked into them, not dramatically, not in a way anyone would have pointed to and said, "Look, the room just changed." But in the way that the air in a room changes when someone opens a window. A subtle but unmistakable shift in the quality of what was present. People felt more at ease. Conversations that had been stuck began to move. Things that had felt heavy became, for a moment, lighter. Sarah did not know she was doing this. She was simply being herself. And being herself at that early age, before the overlay had been installed, meant broadcasting her original frequency without interference. Her heart field was coherent in the specific way that her field was always coherent when she was unguarded. And that coherence radiated outward and influenced every field it touched. But Sarah grew up in a family where her particular quality of presence was not celebrated. It was treated as something that needed to be managed. She was told, in various ways and with various levels of gentleness, that she was too open, too trusting, that her way of moving through the world was naive, that the world would take advantage of someone who radiated the way she did, that she needed to protect herself, that she needed to be more careful, that she needed to pull back. And Sarah, because she was intelligent, and because she loved the people who were telling her this, and because she did not want to be naive or vulnerable or taken advantage of, began to learn. She began to modulate. She began to introduce the secondary pattern into her field, the monitoring, the assessment, the careful management of how much of herself she allowed to radiate at any given moment. By the time she was an adult, the quality that rooms had responded to was still there. She could feel it sometimes, in moments when she forgot to be careful, when she was alone or with someone she trusted completely, or when she was so absorbed in something she loved that the monitoring dropped away. In those moments, the original frequency came through clearly, and she felt in those moments like herself in a way she could not feel the rest of the time. The rest of the time, she felt the interference, the constant low-level effort of maintaining the overlay, the tiredness that came not from doing too much, but from being slightly less than what she actually was for so long that the effort had become invisible. She did not know she was tired from this. She thought she was just tired. She thought this was what being an adult felt like. She thought the version of herself that felt fully alive in those unguarded moments was a luxury, not a baseline. She thought the overlay was her. It was not her. It was never her. It was a learned modulation of her field that had been running so long it had come to feel like her original signal. But the original signal was still there, still running underneath, still generating its characteristic pattern, still waiting for the monitoring to drop away so it could broadcast without interference. The moment Sarah began to understand this, not as a concept, but as a felt recognition of what was actually happening in her own field, was the moment everything began to change. Not because she immediately became the version of herself who lit up rooms again, but because she stopped mistaking the overlay for herself. And that single shift in recognition that this is not me, this is something I learned to do. began to change what her field was broadcasting. Because here is what happens at the quantum level when you stop identifying with the overlay. The interference pattern begins to resolve. Let me be precise about what I mean by that. When your original frequency and the overlay are both running, and you believe the overlay is you, your field broadcasts the full interference pattern, the composite signal, and the quantum field responds to the composite. But when you recognize the overlay as a learned modulation, rather than your original signal, something shifts in the relationship between the two patterns. The overlay does not immediately disappear. It has been running for years, and its neural correlates are well established. But your relationship to it changes. You stop reinforcing it with the energy of identification. And without that reinforcement, its amplitude begins to decrease relative to your original signal. This is not metaphor. This is how electromagnetic interference works. When two signals are running simultaneously, and one is reinforced by a continuous input of energy, and the other is not, the reinforced signal dominates the composite. When you stop reinforcing the overlay with the energy of believing it is you, your original frequency begins to reassert itself in the composite broadcast, not all at once, gradually, but measurably, in the coherence pattern of your heart rate variability, in the quality of your field, in what begins to reach you and what begins to fall away. Now let us go into what the overlay actually is, because this is where most people stop short of full reclamation. They understand that they have been broadcasting a frequency they did not choose. They understand that the original frequency is still there, but they do not fully understand what the overlay is made of, which means they do not know what they are actually dissolving when they begin the reclamation process. The overlay is not your thoughts. This is important. Most approaches to personal transformation operate at the level of thought. Change your thoughts, change your reality. And while your thoughts are not irrelevant to your frequency, they are not the primary layer of the overlay. They are a surface expression of it. The overlay itself is installed at a deeper level, at the level of the autonomic nervous system, at the level of what the body has learned to do automatically, without conscious instruction. In response to the patterns it was exposed to early and repeatedly. Here is what that means specifically. Your autonomic nervous system has two primary operating modes. The sympathetic mode, which is oriented toward threat response, toward mobilization, toward the assessment of danger and the preparation to respond to it, and the parasympathetic mode, which is oriented toward restoration, toward connection, toward the state of physiological ease in which your body's natural regenerative processes can operate. Your original frequency, the one you were broadcasting before the overlay was installed, was generated primarily from a parasympathetic baseline. Not because you were naive or unaware of the world's complexity, but because your field had not yet learned to treat the world as primarily threatening. Your heart rate variability pattern in that original state was smooth and coherent. Your field was radiating from a place of open, unconstricted presence. The overlay is a learned shift toward sympathetic dominance, not the acute sympathetic activation of a genuine emergency, something subtler and more pervasive, a chronic, low-level sympathetic tone that keeps the monitoring active, keeps the assessment running, keeps the field in a state of partial constriction, even when there is nothing in the immediate environment that requires it. Researchers studying the autonomic nervous system call this allostatic load. The cumulative physiological cost of maintaining a heightened state of readiness over time. And it has a direct correlate in the coherence pattern of the heart field. Chronic sympathetic dominance disrupts heart rate, variability, coherence. It introduces the low-frequency irregularity into the electromagnetic signal that your heart broadcasts. And that disrupted signal is what the quantum field has been responding to. Not your intentions, not your desires, not the life you have been consciously trying to create. The disrupted signal of a field that learned to constrict itself before it could be asked to. This is why intellectual understanding alone does not reclaim the frequency. You can understand everything I am telling you right now and still wake up tomorrow broadcasting the overlay, because the overlay is not stored in your understanding. It is stored in your autonomic nervous system, in the learned pattern of your body's baseline response to being alive in the world. And to reclaim your original frequency, you have to work at that level, at the level of the nervous system, at the level of the body's learned broadcast. And here is the extraordinary thing about this. The nervous system is not fixed. The autonomic baseline is not permanently determined by what was learned early. The field of neuroscience has spent the last 2 decades documenting what they call neuroplasticity, the capacity of the nervous system to reorganize itself in response to new experience. And the heart math research has shown something even more specific and more immediately applicable. that the autonomic baseline, the characteristic pattern of heart rate variability that determines the quality of your electromagnetic field, can be shifted deliberately through specific practices that work directly with the heart's rhythm, not shifted permanently in a single session, but shifted measurably in a single practice, and with consistent practice shifted in baseline, meaning the overlay begins to thin. The original frequency begins to reassert itself in the composite signal, and the quantum field begins to respond to a different broadcast. Before we go into the practice, I want to address something that comes up for almost everyone at this point in the reclamation process. The question of whether the original frequency is actually worth reclaiming, because the overlay was not installed randomly. It was installed in response to real experiences, real moments when being fully present in your field had costs. Real moments when your openness was used against you, or your radiance was punished, or your particular quality of being in the world caused problems that the overlay helped you avoid. The overlay worked. That is why it stayed. It was a genuine adaptation to genuine conditions. And there is a part of you that is not sure it is safe to let it go. A part that remembers why it was installed and is not convinced those reasons no longer apply. A part that has been monitoring for so long that the monitoring itself feels like protection. If this recognition of what the overlay is made of and what dissolving it actually requires is landing somewhere deep in you, there is something more I want to offer you. Have you spent years trying to feel lit up again? Visualizations, affirmations, vibration work, and the light still won't hold? Every one of those methods is telling you to push harder, do more, add another technique. It's not working because the issue isn't that you don't have enough light. 6 specific patterns are sitting on top of it. They're called the frequencies of forgetting. The remembering field, a quantum guide to returning to the light. You forgot you were carrying walks through all 5 parts of getting those patterns off you. Every tool you used tried to add more light. This one lifts what's been sitting on the light you already carry. The longer you wait, the harder they get to clear. So go open it tonight. The link is in the pinned comment below. I want to speak directly to that part of you right now. Not to dismiss it, not to tell it that its concerns are unfounded, but to show it something about the mathematics of protection that changes the calculation. Here is what the overlay actually costs in terms of protection. Your heart field, when it is in a state of high coherence, meaning when it is broadcasting your original frequency without significant interference, generates a field that has been shown to influence the coherence of other fields nearby. A coherent field is not a vulnerable field. It is the opposite. A coherent field is one that is generating a strong, ordered, consistent signal. And in the electromagnetic world, a strong, coherent signal is not easily overridden by weaker or more chaotic signals. It does not absorb them. It does not entrain to them. It maintains its own pattern, and in proximity tends to pull other fields toward greater coherence. The overlay, by contrast, disrupts your coherence. It takes your field from a state of strong, ordered signal to a state of interference pattern. And an interference pattern is actually more susceptible to influence from external fields than a coherent one, because it is already internally divided. It is already not fully committed to its own signal. And a field that is not fully committed to its own signal is more easily pulled by other signals than one that is broadcasting with full coherence. In other words, the overlay that was installed to protect you is actually reducing your field's natural protective coherence. The very adaptation that was meant to make you safer is making your field more susceptible to the influence of other people's frequencies, other people's energy, other people's chaos. Your original frequency, broadcast with full coherence, is not naive openness. It is the strongest version of your field. And the strongest version of your field is the most protected version of your field. This is the paradox of reclamation. You reclaim your original frequency not by becoming more vulnerable, but by becoming more fully yourself. And a field that is fully itself is the most coherent, most powerful, most genuinely protected field you can generate. Now, the practice. This is not a generic breathing exercise. This is a specific protocol for working directly with the coherence pattern of your heart rate. Variability, to begin dissolving the interference between your original frequency and the overlay. It works at the autonomic nervous system level. It is the level where the overlay lives, and it is the level where the reclamation actually happens. Find a position where your spine can be relatively upright and your body can be still. Not rigid, just settled. If you can place one hand on your chest over your heart, do that now. The physical contact with your chest is not symbolic. The warmth and pressure of your own hand on your chest activates the afferent nerve pathways that run from the skin and the heart to the brain. And those pathways are part of the feedback loop that influences your autonomic state. You are not just gesturing toward your heart. You are activating a physiological communication channel. Now begin to slow your breathing. Not dramatically, not in a way that requires effort. Just allow your exhale to become slightly longer than your inhale. If your inhale is Aum, or 5 seconds, let your exhale extend to 6 or 7. This ratio, a slightly extended exhale, activates the parasympathetic branch of your autonomic nervous system through the vagus nerve. It is a direct physiological signal to your nervous system that you are safe, that the monitoring can ease, that the overlay can, for this moment, relax its grip. Continue this breathing for a moment. Just the extended exhale. Feel your body begin to respond to it. Feel the subtle shift in the quality of your chest, your shoulders, the muscles around your eyes. This is your autonomic nervous system beginning to shift its baseline. This is the first movement of reclamation. Now, with your hand on your heart and your breathing in this extended exhale rhythm, bring your attention into the space of your chest, not to your thoughts about your chest, into the physical sensation of the space itself, the warmth there, the movement of your breath moving through it, the beat of your heart beneath your hand. And now, from that place of physical attention to the actual space of your heart, I want you to recall a moment when you felt most fully yourself. Not a moment when you were performing well, or being praised, or achieving something. A moment when you were simply present in your own experience without monitoring it. A moment when the overlay was quiet, and what was radiating from you was what has always been there underneath. It might have been alone. It might have been with someone you trusted completely. It might have been in nature, or in a creative act, or in a moment of such complete absorption in something you loved that the assessment simply stopped. Find that moment. And rather than thinking about it, feel it. Feel the quality of your own presence in that moment. The particular texture of what it felt like to be you when you were not managing yourself. That quality, that texture, that is your original frequency, not as a concept, as a felt experience that your body remembers. Stay with that felt experience for a full minute. Let your heart rate variability begin to entrain to it. Let your field begin to broadcast it. Notice what happens in your chest as you do this. Notice whether there is a quality of expansion, of warmth, of something that feels like coming home to a room you forgot was yours. That is not imagination. That is your electromagnetic field beginning to shift its coherence pattern toward your original frequency. That is the interference beginning to resolve. That is the overlay for this moment, losing its dominance in your composite signal. And your field is broadcasting this shift right now. into the space around your body, into the quantum field that is always reading your signal, into the composite of what you are radiating. Stay here as long as you can, and when you are ready, continue. What you just experienced in that practice is the mechanism of reclamation, not the completion of it, the mechanism. Because reclamation is not a single event. It is a process of returning repeatedly to the felt experience of your original frequency until the nervous system begins to establish it as the new baseline, until the overlay loses the reinforcement of your constant identification with it, until your heart field's coherence pattern begins to reflect your original signal more than the interference. I want to pause here and ask you something, because your experience matters, and the field of this community is strengthened when we share it. Have you ever had a moment when your aura seemed to shift? When you walked into a room and felt your energy change the quality of what was there? Or when someone responded to you differently, as if they were responding to a version of you that was more fully present than usual? I would love to hear about it in the comments. What did that moment feel like in your own field? This is what the research on heart rate variability coherence training has documented. That consistent practice of returning to coherent emotional states, specifically states that are associated with your most authentic self, rather than states of managed performance, measurably shifts the autonomic baseline over time. The low-frequency irregularity in the heart field decreases. The smooth, ordered rhythm of high coherence increases. And the electromagnetic field that your heart broadcasts into the space around you begins to carry a different signal. And the quantum field responds to that different signal. Now, I want to go into something that most conversations about reclaiming your frequency never reach, because they stop at the level of the individual field. They talk about your frequency as though it exists in isolation, as though reclaiming it is something that happens entirely within you and then radiates outward into a passive world. But the quantum mechanics of field interaction are more complex and more extraordinary than that. And understanding them changes not just how you reclaim your frequency, but what you understand your frequency to be doing in the world. David Bohm, the quantum physicist who spent decades studying the hidden structure of reality, described what he called the implicate order, the idea that beneath the surface of what we observe, beneath the visible, measurable, seemingly separate world of objects and events, there is an enfolded dimension where everything that appears to be separate is actually connected, where what looks like a fixed particle in a fixed location is actually a temporary expression of a much deeper pattern that contains within it all the possibilities of what that particle could be. Bohm was not speaking poetically. He was describing a mathematical structure that his decades of work in quantum mechanics had led him to, with the precision of someone who had followed the evidence past every comfortable stopping point. He was saying that the world you see is the outermost expression of a depth that the world you see does not reveal. That the visible is always and only the surface of an implicate order that is doing the actual work of creation beneath it. What this means for your energy field is this: your electromagnetic field does not exist in isolation within a passive environment. It exists within the implicate order. It is an expression of a deeper pattern that is already connected to everything else in the field. And when your field shifts its coherence pattern, when you begin to reclaim your original frequency and the interference begins to resolve, that shift does not simply change what radiates from you into a neutral space. It changes your relationship to the implicate order itself. It changes which patterns in the deeper field you are in resonance with. It changes what is available to unfold from the implicate into your experience. This is the quantum mechanics of why reclaiming your original frequency reorganizes reality around you. Not because you are projecting your desires outward and the universe is obligingly fulfilling them, because your field is the interface between your individual experience and the implicate order. And the quality of that interface, the coherence of your field, the clarity of your original signal, determines which aspects of the implicate order can unfold into your experience and which cannot. An interference pattern does not interface cleanly with the implicate order. It is internally divided, and that internal division limits the range of patterns it can resonate with. A coherent field, broadcasting your original frequency clearly, interfaces with a much broader range of the implicate order. It is in resonance with patterns that the interference pattern could not reach. And those patterns, when they unfold from the implicate into the explicate, into your visible experience, appear as what we call opportunity, connection, synchronicity, the sense that reality is suddenly cooperating with you in ways it was not before. They were always there, in the implicate order, waiting to unfold. What changed was the coherence of your field, the clarity of your signal, the degree to which your original frequency could reach them. Here is what this means practically. When people describe the experience of having reclaimed their frequency, they do not usually describe it as suddenly getting everything they wanted. They describe it as a shift in what appears in their field of experience. People who resonate with their original frequency begin to appear. Situations that align with their actual nature begin to present themselves. Opportunities that would have been invisible to them when the overlay was dominant become visible. Not because they are looking harder, but because their field is now in resonance with them. And simultaneously, things that were held in place by the overlay begin to fall away. Relationships that were built on the version of you that was managing itself, that were sustained by the energy of the overlay, begin to feel misaligned. Situations that required you to broadcast the overlay to maintain them begin to feel costly in a way they did not before. Not because those things are bad, but because they were assembled around the interference pattern. And as the interference resolves, they no longer have the signal to sustain them. This falling away is not loss. It is the quantum field reorganizing around your actual frequency. It is reality beginning to assemble itself around who you actually are, rather than who the overlay was broadcasting. And while it can feel disorienting, particularly when what falls away is something you had worked hard to build or maintain, it is the signature of genuine reclamation. The field is clearing. The original signal is reasserting itself. And what reality assembles around that signal is more aligned with your actual nature than what was assembled around the interference. Let me come back to Sarah, because her story does not end with recognition. Recognition was the beginning. What happened after was the part that required something different. After Sarah understood that the overlay was not her, she went through a period that she had not expected. She had expected that seeing the overlay clearly would dissolve it, that the recognition itself would be the reclamation. And in some ways, the recognition did begin to shift things. She felt moments of her original frequency coming through more clearly, more often. The unguarded moments became more frequent. The monitoring had, in some places, begun to ease. But in other places, the overlay reasserted itself with what felt like increased intensity, as if it knew it was being seen and was fighting to remain. She would have a day of extraordinary clarity and openness, of feeling her field radiating cleanly and freely, and then wake up the next morning in the familiar constriction, the familiar monitoring, the familiar sense of managing herself. And the contrast, now that she knew what the original frequency felt like, was more painful than the overlay had been when she did not know she was wearing it. What Sarah was experiencing is what happens when reclamation is understood as an event rather than a process. The overlay is not dissolved by a single recognition. It is dissolved by the gradual withdrawal of the energy that sustains it. And that withdrawal happens not through force, not through fighting the overlay or trying to suppress it, but through the consistent practice of returning to the felt experience of the original frequency. Each return strengthens the coherence pattern of the original signal. Each return withdraws a small amount of energy from the overlay's pattern. And over time, with enough returns, the balance shifts. The original frequency becomes the dominant signal in the composite broadcast. The overlay loses its grip, not because it was defeated, but because it was no longer fed. Sarah learned this. Not all at once. Through the repeated experience of returning to her original frequency in practice, in the quiet of her own attention, and then watching the overlay reassert itself, and then returning again. She learned to stop treating the overlay's reassertion as evidence that the reclamation was not working. She learned to treat it as information, as the field showing her where the overlay was still stored, as an invitation to return to the practice rather than a sign that the practice had failed. And gradually, over months of this returning, something shifted that she could not have predicted from the beginning of the process. The overlay did not disappear, but it became transparent. She could feel it when it activated. She could notice the moment her field began to constrict, the moment the monitoring came back online, the moment she began to manage herself rather than simply be herself. And in the noticing, she had a choice that she had not had before. Not the choice to immediately override the overlay, but the choice to not identify with it, to notice it as something happening in her field rather than something that was her field. And that noticing, that consistent not identifying, was itself a form of the practice, a continuous withdrawal of the energy of identification from the overlay, a continuous small return to the original frequency. The rooms began to change again, not dramatically, not in a way anyone would have pointed to and said, "Look, Sarah is different now," but in the way that the air in a room changes when someone opens a window. The quality that had been there when she was young, before the overlay was installed, before she learned to manage herself, was coming back. Not as a performance, not as something she was doing, as something she was, as the natural expression of a field that was beginning to broadcast its original signal with less interference. And what was assembling around that signal was different from what had been assembling around the interference pattern. Not dramatically, not all at once, but consistently, and in a direction she recognized as right, as aligned with something she had always known herself to be, even when she could not feel it clearly. That is the shape of reclamation. Not a single moment of transformation. A process of returning, of not identifying, of allowing the original frequency to reassert itself gradually, and then watching what reality assembles around it. Now let us go into the specific mechanics of what happens in your field in the period immediately following the beginning of reclamation. Because this is the period that most people find most confusing, and most people misread the signals they receive during it. When you begin to reclaim your original frequency, the first thing that happens in your field is not a clean signal. It is actually a period of increased interference. This sounds counterintuitive, but it makes precise sense when you understand the electromagnetic mechanics. When two signals that have been running simultaneously begin to shift their relative amplitudes, the period of transition is characterized by more complex interference patterns than either signal alone would produce. This is a fundamental principle of wave physics. When you increase the amplitude of your original frequency signal while the overlay is still running at its previous amplitude, the composite becomes more complex before it becomes cleaner. The two signals are not yet fully resolved. They are in a period of dynamic interaction, and that dynamic interaction can feel from the inside like increased confusion, increased sensitivity, increased awareness of the gap between who you actually are and who you have been broadcasting. This is not regression. This is the field in the process of reorganization. And understanding it as reorganization rather than failure is critical to continuing the reclamation process through this period, rather than retreating back into the overlay, because the increased interference feels worse than the familiar constriction. The second thing that happens in your field during early reclamation is what researchers studying autonomic nervous system regulation call the window of tolerance expanding. As your parasympathetic baseline begins to shift, as the chronic low-level sympathetic tone of the overlay begins to ease, your field becomes capable of holding more without constricting. Things that previously triggered the overlay, situations that previously caused your field to constrict into the managed, monitored broadcast, begin to be something you can meet with more of your original frequency intact. Not all at once, but the window within which you can be fully present in your field without the overlay activating begins to widen. And as that window widens, something else happens that is perhaps the most significant change in your field during this period. Your field becomes more readable, not in the sense that you become more transparent or more vulnerable, in the sense that what you are broadcasting becomes more coherent and therefore more clearly interpretable by the fields around you. When you were broadcasting the interference pattern, the composite signal was complex and mixed. People and situations could not easily read your field because the field itself was not giving a clear signal. Now, as the original frequency reasserts itself, the signal becomes cleaner, and cleaner signals are more easily resonated with by fields that are looking for that particular frequency. This is why, in the period of early reclamation, people often report that the right people begin to appear. People who seem to see them clearly, who respond to them in ways that feel aligned with who they actually are, rather than who they were performing. This is not coincidence. It is field resonance. Your cleaner signal is reaching people whose fields are compatible with it in ways the interference pattern could not reach them. And those people are responding to what they can now actually read in your field. This is also why, in the same period, certain existing relationships can become strained, because those relationships were built on the interface between your interference pattern and other people's fields. Some of those people were in resonance with the overlay, specifically with the managed, monitored, constricted version of your broadcast. And as your field begins to broadcast more of your original frequency, the resonance that sustained those relationships begins to change. This is not a reason to end those relationships, but it is information about what they were built on. And it is an invitation to allow them to reconfigure around your actual signal rather than the overlay. Some will not. And the ones that cannot reconfigure around your original frequency were not, in the deepest sense, relationships with you. They were relationships with the overlay. And the overlay was never you. Let me address the question of time, because one of the most common points of discouragement in the reclamation process is the expectation that it should happen faster than it does. That if the original frequency is real, if it is truly still running underneath, it should come through clearly once you have recognized the overlay. That the recognition should be enough. The overlay was not installed in a moment. It was installed over years of repeated experience, years of the nervous system learning in response to real conditions that certain frequencies were not safe to broadcast. Years of the heart field learning to modulate its output in the direction of constriction. Years of the autonomic baseline shifting toward the sympathetic dominance that underlies the overlay. That installation was gradual. The dissolution is also gradual. Not because your original frequency is weak or damaged, because the nervous system changes through repetition, not through single events. And the repetition required to shift the autonomic baseline is the repetition of returning to your original frequency. In practice and in life, enough times that the nervous system begins to establish it as the new normal. The research on heart rate variability, coherence training, suggests that measurable shifts in autonomic baseline can begin to appear within weeks of consistent daily practice. Not complete dissolution of the overlay, but measurable shifts in the direction of coherence. Measurable increases in the amplitude of the original frequency in the composite signal. Measurable decreases in the low frequency irregularity that the overlay introduces. Weeks, not years, not decades. Weeks of consistent returning to the felt experience of your original frequency, practiced in the specific way that works directly with the heart's rhythm, can begin to shift what your field is broadcasting in ways that are measurable in your heart rate variability and felt in the quality of your daily experience. And what begins to shift in your experience during those weeks is not dramatic. It is subtle and consistent. A slightly greater ease in your own presence. A slightly smaller gap between who you are in your unguarded moments and who you are in your daily life. A slightly cleaner signal in your field. A slightly greater resonance between what you are broadcasting and what is beginning to appear in your experience. Subtle and consistent. That is the signature of genuine reclamation. Not the dramatic single moment of transformation, the gradual reassertion of something that was always there, becoming clearer and cleaner and more dominant in your composite broadcast over time. There is something else I want to name about the reclamation process that is rarely addressed: the grief of it. Because when you begin to reclaim your original frequency, when you begin to feel more clearly what you have been broadcasting and what it has been costing you, there is often grief. Not for what you lost. You did not lose your original frequency. It was always there. The grief is for the time. For the years when the overlay was running and you did not know it. For the relationships and opportunities and experiences that were shaped by the interference pattern rather than your actual signal. for the version of yourself that was always there, always radiating, always trying to come through, and was met instead with the managed, monitored, constricted version that the overlay was broadcasting. That grief is real, and it deserves acknowledgement, not because dwelling in it serves the reclamation, but because trying to bypass it does not. The grief is part of the field's processing of what it has been carrying. It is the emotional correlate of the overlay beginning to release, and allowing it, feeling it without being consumed by it, without using it as evidence that the reclamation is not possible, is part of the process. The grief does not mean you failed. It means you can now feel the difference between your original frequency and the overlay clearly enough to mourn the gap. And mourning the gap is not the same as living in it. It is a passage through it, a moment of full acknowledgement before the field continues its reorganization toward the original signal. Now, let us return to the deeper current of what we have been tracing together, because the next layer of this transmission takes everything we have just named into territory that changes what you understand your field to be doing in the world. Let me show you what your field is doing right now, in this moment, as you have been receiving this transmission. Something has been shifting in your field during this time, not because of what I have said, because of what you have recognized. Because some part of you has been listening to this and finding in it a description of something you already knew, something you have felt in those unguarded moments when the overlay was quiet and what was radiating from you was the original frequency, something you have been trying to articulate for a long time and have not had the precise language for. That recognition is itself a form of coherence. The moment your conscious understanding aligns with what your field has always known, the interference between your conscious mind and your field decreases. The overlay loses one of its primary mechanisms of reinforcement, which is the belief that it is you. And your original frequency, in response, moves slightly closer to the surface of your composite broadcast. Your field right now is in a state of slightly greater coherence than it was when you began. Not because of anything you did, because of something you recognized. And that recognition is already changing what you are broadcasting into the quantum field. The quantum field is already responding. And I want to ask you this, because I genuinely want to know. Has there been a moment in your own life when you felt your light come back on? When the warmth of your own field seemed to activate, and the people around you responded to something in you that you had not even announced? leave that in the comments. These shared experiences are part of the collective field, and reading them activates something in others too. Now let me go into something that takes the mechanics of reclamation to a level that most people never reach. Because everything I have described so far has been about the individual field, your overlay, your original frequency, your reclamation. But your field does not exist in isolation. It exists within a variety of fields. And the mechanics of how your field interacts with other fields adds a dimension to the reclamation process that changes what you understand yourself to be doing when you reclaim your frequency. The principle is called field entrainment, and it has been documented not just in the heart math research, but in physics, in neuroscience, in the study of coupled oscillators across a wide range of systems. The principle is this: when two oscillating systems are in proximity, they tend to synchronize. The stronger, more coherent signal tends to pull the weaker or more chaotic signal toward its own pattern. This is not a one-directional influence. It is a mutual process of resonance. But the direction of entrainment is consistently toward the more coherent signal. What this means for your field is that when you are broadcasting your original frequency with high coherence, you are not just changing your own experience. You are influencing the fields around you. Every person whose field comes into proximity with yours is being influenced by your coherent broadcast. Not controlled, not overridden, influenced in the direction of their own coherence, in the direction of their own original frequency. This is what Sarah was doing in those early years before the overlay was installed. This is why rooms changed when she walked into them. Her field was broadcasting its original frequency with high coherence, and that coherent broadcast was pulling the fields around her toward greater coherence. Not because she was trying to affect anyone, because that is what a coherent field does in proximity to other fields. It is not an act of will. It is a property of coherence itself. And when you reclaim your original frequency, when your field begins to broadcast with the coherence of your actual signal, rather than the interference of the overlay, you begin to do this again. Not as something you do, as something your field is. Every room you walk into is being influenced by your coherent broadcast. Every person whose field comes into proximity with yours is being pulled, gently and without any act of will on your part, toward their own coherence, toward their own original frequency. This is not a small thing. This is the mechanism by which individual reclamation ripples outward, by which one person's return to their original frequency influences the fields of everyone they encounter, by which the reclamation of a single field contributes to the coherence of the larger field, by which your personal return to your original frequency is simultaneously a contribution to the world, not because you are trying to contribute, because coherence radiates, because a field broadcasting its original signal with clarity and power influences every field it touches, because the most world-changing thing you can do is not to try to change the world, but to reclaim your own frequency and let the entrainment do what entrainment does. Your original frequency was not just yours. It was always also a gift to every field that came into contact with it. And the overlay that suppressed it was not just a cost to you. It was a cost to everyone who would have been influenced by your coherent broadcast. Everyone who would have felt that shift in the room. Everyone who would have found their own field pulled gently and without knowing why toward greater coherence by proximity to yours. Reclaiming your frequency is not selfish. It is the opposite of selfish. It is the restoration of a coherent signal to a field that the world needs to be in resonance with. Now I want to go into something even more specific about what entrainment costs when it runs in the wrong direction. Because this is the part of the overlay's damage that most people have never considered. Most people think about what the overlay costs them in terms of their own experience, their own aliveness, their own sense of being present in their life. And those costs are real. But there is a cost that extends outward that is equally real, and that the overlay has been extracting from the world without your knowledge. When your field is broadcasting an interference pattern, it is not simply failing to pull other fields toward coherence. It is doing something more active than that. A field in a state of significant interference, particularly one that has been running the overlay for a long time, generates what the heart math researchers describe as an incoherent signal. A signal that other autonomic nervous systems can detect and respond to, even in the absence of any verbal or behavioral cue. The people around you are reading your field, not consciously. Their own autonomic nervous systems are registering the quality of your broadcast and adjusting their own state in response. When your field is broadcasting coherence, their nervous systems register safety. They ease. Their own parasympathetic tone increases slightly. The monitoring in their own fields decreases, they become, in proximity to you, slightly more themselves. This is what Sarah did to rooms. This is what a coherent field does to the fields around it. It is not a metaphor. It is a measurable, autonomic response. When your field is broadcasting an interference pattern, the opposite can happen. Other nervous systems register the mixed signal, and their own monitoring increases slightly. The subtle message of the interference pattern is that something here is not settled. Something here is not safe. And that message propagates outward through field entrainment in the same way that coherence does. Not dramatically, not in a way anyone would point to and name, but measurably in the autonomic tone of the people around you. You have been affecting the fields around you this whole time. The only question has been whether you were affecting them in the direction of coherence or in the direction of increased monitoring. And the answer to that question has been determined entirely by the quality of your own broadcast, by how much of your original frequency has been coming through clearly and how much has been interfered with by the overlay. This is not a reason for guilt. The overlay was not your fault. It was installed in response to real conditions, and it served a real purpose. But understanding this outward cost of the interference pattern is one more reason, and perhaps the most compelling reason of all, to complete the reclamation. Not for yourself alone. For every field that will come into proximity with yours once the original signal is broadcasting clearly. For every person who will feel, without knowing why, slightly more at ease in your presence, slightly more themselves, slightly more able to access their own original frequency, because yours is no longer adding to the monitoring in the air. Your reclamation is not a private matter. It is a field event, and the ripples of it extend further than you can see. There is a specific moment in the reclamation process that nobody warns you about, and that almost everyone misreads when it arrives. I want to name it precisely so that when it comes, you recognize it for what it is, rather than treating it as evidence that the reclamation is failing. The moment is this: the first time you are in a situation that used to reliably trigger the overlay, a situation where you would have previously constricted, monitored, managed, pulled back, and you do not. Not because you decided not to, not because you reminded yourself of everything you know about your original frequency, but because the overlay simply did not activate. Because your autonomic baseline has shifted enough that the trigger no longer reaches the threshold required to install the constriction. and you move through that situation, broadcasting more of your original frequency than you ever have in that context before. That moment is extraordinary. It is the nervous system demonstrating that the reclamation is working at the level where the overlay lives, not just at the level of your understanding. It is evidence that the baseline has shifted, that the practice has been accumulating, that the repeated returning to your original frequency has been doing exactly what it was doing, and the results are now visible in your behavior and your field, not just in your felt experience during practice. But here is what often happens immediately after that moment. The overlay reasserts itself, sometimes with significant force, in a different context, as if the nervous system, having lost its grip in one area, is compensating by tightening its grip in another. And if you do not understand this as a normal part of the reorganization process, you will interpret it as evidence that the moment of freedom was an anomaly, a fluke, that the overlay is still fully in charge, and the practice is not working as well as you thought. It is not a fluke. It is the field in the process of reorganizing. The overlay does not dissolve evenly across all contexts simultaneously. It dissolves unevenly, in patches, in the areas where the practice has been most consistent and the nervous system has had the most opportunity to establish the new baseline. And as it dissolves in those areas, it can temporarily intensify in the areas where it is still holding. This is not regression. This is the reorganization showing you where the next layer of the work is, where the next consistent returning needs to happen, where the practice needs to be applied next. Understanding this prevents one of the most common forms of abandonment of the reclamation process. The abandonment that comes from interpreting the overlay's intensification in one area as evidence that the freedom experienced in another area was not real. Both are real. The freedom was real, and it will persist and expand. The intensification is real, and it is temporary, and it is information. And the correct response to both is the same. Return to the practice. Return to the felt experience of your original frequency. Return to the hand on the heart, the extended exhale, the specific memory of what it feels like to be you, without the monitoring. And let the nervous system continue its reorganization at the pace that is actually available to it. Now let me take you into one more layer of what happens in your field as the reclamation deepens. Because there is a quality of experience that becomes available as the original frequency reasserts itself, that is not just the absence of the overlay. It is something additional, something that the overlay, by its nature, was preventing from being broadcast. When your heart field is in a state of high coherence, the HeartMath researchers have documented that the field begins to exhibit what they call global coherence effects. The ordered, smooth rhythm of high heart rate variability. Coherence is not just the absence of the low-frequency irregularity of the overlay. It is the presence of a specific pattern of rhythmic order that has been associated with states of deep, intuitive clarity, of enhanced perception, of what researchers describe as access to information that is not available through ordinary sensory processing. This is not mystical language. It is a description of what happens when the nervous system is operating in a state of high coherence. The brain's own electromagnetic activity begins to synchronize with the heart's coherent rhythm in a process called heart-brain coherence. And in that state of synchronization, the brain's processing capacity shifts. The prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for higher order thinking, pattern recognition, and what we call intuition, receives a stronger, more ordered signal from the heart, and the quality of its processing changes. People in states of high heart-brain coherence consistently report enhanced clarity. The sense that they can see the situation they are in more fully and more accurately than usual. That they can perceive patterns and possibilities that were invisible to them when they were in the overlay's sympathetic dominance. That they know things they did not know a moment ago. Not through reasoning, but through a quality of direct perception that feels different from ordinary thought. This is what becomes available as your original frequency reasserts itself. Not just the absence of the overlay's constriction, the presence of a quality of perception that the overlay was actively blocking. Because the overlay's chronic sympathetic dominance was disrupting the heart-brain coherence that makes this perception possible. The monitoring was using the very neural resources that would otherwise be available for the deep, intuitive clarity of a coherent field. When the overlay thins, those resources become available again. The heart-brain coherence increases, and with it, the quality of perception that has always been part of your original frequency. The quality that allowed you to read situations clearly, to sense what was true beneath the surface of what was presented, to navigate by something deeper than analysis, becomes accessible again. This is one of the things people notice most specifically as their reclamation deepens. Not just that they feel more like themselves, that they can see more clearly, that their judgment feels sharper, and more trustworthy. That they know things in a way that is difficult to articulate, but that consistently proves accurate. That the world has become more legible to them in some fundamental way that has nothing to do with acquiring new information, and everything to do with the quality of the field through which they are perceiving it. Your original frequency was not just a broadcast. It was also a receiver, a field capable of perceiving at a depth that the overlay was blocking. And as the reclamation deepens, both dimensions of your field are being restored. The broadcast and the reception, the signal you are sending, and the signal you are capable of reading. This is why people who have undergone deep reclamation often describe feeling as though reality has become more responsive, more legible, more available to them. Not because reality changed, because the quality of their field's reception changed, because the heart-brain coherence that was disrupted by the overlay has been restored, because they are now perceiving through a coherent field rather than an interference pattern. And a coherent field perceives more of what is actually there. If you feel called to, return to this transmission during a quiet moment, in the stillness of early morning before the day installs its own overlay, or in the space before sleep when the field is most receptive and the overlay is naturally thin. And if someone in your life is carrying the weight of their own interference pattern, consider sharing this with them. Sharing is itself a coherent act. It sends a ripple of radiance into another field, activating their awareness of their own original frequency. And in that activation, both fields strengthen through resonance. The collective luminosity grows not through grand gestures, but through one field, reminding another that the light was never off. Let me bring this to the final layer, the one that underlies everything I have described, the one that, when you feel it rather than just understand it, changes your relationship to the reclamation process from effort to recognition. Your original frequency is not something you created. It is not something you earned. It is not something you have to work to deserve. It is the frequency of your actual nature, the signal of what you're at the level beneath every story that was ever told about you, beneath every overlay that was ever installed, beneath every moment of constriction and management and careful monitoring of how much of yourself you allowed to radiate. The ancient traditions that described the individual as a wave of the infinite ocean were not speaking metaphorically. They were describing the same reality that Bohm's implicate order describes in the language of physics. That beneath the surface of your individual experience, beneath the overlay and the interference and the composite signal that has been shaping your life, there is a depth that is not individual. A depth that is the same depth that underlies everything, always waiting for the interference to resolve so it can broadcast clearly. This is what reclamation actually is. Not building something new, not becoming someone different, not achieving a state you do not currently have, removing what is interfering with the broadcast of what was always there, dissolving the overlay, allowing the original signal to come through, letting what you actually are be what your field is broadcasting. You do not have to earn this. You do not have to deserve it. You do not have to wait until you have worked through enough of your conditioning, or healed enough of your history, or accumulated enough spiritual understanding. You can begin right now, in this moment, with the practice you already did in this transmission, with the recognition you already had, with the felt sense of your original frequency that you have already touched. That touching was not a preview of something that might be available to you later. It was a moment of the original frequency coming through. A moment of the overlay thinning. A moment of your field broadcasting its actual signal. And in that moment, the quantum field responded, not to what you hoped, not to what you intended, to what you were actually broadcasting. Your original frequency is not a destination. It is where you started. It is what you are. And the entire process of reclamation is simply the process of returning, of coming back, of finding your way home to the signal that has been running beneath everything, waiting for you to stop broadcasting someone else's frequency and simply be the light that you have always been. That light is on. It has never been off. It has only been interfered with. And now you know what the interference is. And now you know what the reclamation process actually does in your field. And now you have touched your original frequency in a way that your nervous system will remember. And now you have begun. There is a question I want to leave with you, not to answer now, to carry with you as you continue this process, to return to in the moments when the overlay reasserts itself and you are not sure whether to trust the reclamation or retreat into the familiar constriction. The question is this: what would you be doing differently right now in your life as it actually is if you were broadcasting your original frequency without interference? Not as a fantasy, as a genuine inquiry. If your field were radiating your actual signal cleanly and coherently, without the overlay, modulating it toward constriction and management and careful monitoring of how much of yourself you allow to be present. What would be different? What would you be saying that you are not saying? Where would you be going that you are not going? What would you be allowing yourself to want, to create, to reach for, that the overlay has been telling you is not safe, or not possible, or not yours to have? That question is a compass, and the direction it points is the direction of your original frequency, not as a concept, as a lived orientation, as the daily practice of choosing in each moment where the choice is available to broadcast the original signal rather than the overlay, to return again and again to the felt experience of what you are when you are not managing yourself. To let that experience become the new baseline. To let that baseline become what your field broadcasts into the quantum field. To let the quantum field respond to your actual signal and watch what it assembles around you. What it assembles will not be what the overlay would have predicted. The overlay predicts a world that requires your constriction. Your original frequency broadcasts into a world that responds to your coherence. And those two worlds, assembled around those two signals, are not the same world. The world assembled around your original frequency is the one that has been waiting for your signal to become clear enough to reach it. It is becoming clear now. Your field is active. Your original frequency is running. The reclamation has begun. And what reality assembles around this signal is something the overlay never could have shown you. Welcome back to yourself. Welcome back to your actual broadcast. Welcome back to the frequency that was always yours, always running, always waiting for you to stop dimming it and simply let it radiate. That is what your energy field actually does when you reclaim your original frequency. It stops working against itself. It resolves the interference. It broadcasts the signal that is actually yours. And reality, which has been waiting for that signal, begins to reorganize around it. Not because of anything you have to do next, because of what you already are, because of the frequency that was running before anyone told you who you were, because of the light that has been on this whole time beneath everything, waiting for you to see it. You see it now. Shine.